The rain drummed against the windows of Mel's diner like an endless rhythm of desperation, each drop a reminder of the cold world outside. Marcus Washington pulled his worn military jacket tighter around his shoulders as he sat in the corner, Booth nursing a cup of coffee that had long since grown cold. The ceramic mug bore chips and stains from countless other hands. But to Marcus, it represented something precious, a moment of warmth in a life that had grown increasingly cold over the past 3 years. At 42, Marcus carried himself with the straight-backed posture that 20 years in the army had drilled into his bones, but his eyes held shadows that spoke of battles fought on streets rather than foreign soil. His dark skin was weathered not just by time, but by too many nights spent under bridges and in doorways, searching for shelter from storms both literal and metaphorical. The few belongings he owned were packed neatly in a battered duffel bag at his feet, a bag that had traveled with him from Afghanistan to Iraq, and now accompanied him on a different kind of survival mission through the unforgiving landscape of homelessness. The diner buzzed with the comfortable chatter of late evening customers, a mix of truckers, night shift workers, and insomniacs seeking refuge in the fluorescent-lit sanctuary. Marcus had been coming here for weeks, always ordering just enough to justify his presence, always polite to Sarah, the kind-hearted waitress who never made him feel unwelcome. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt different. He noticed the way some customers glanced at him with barely concealed discomfort, how conversations seemed to quiet when he passed by their tables. Marcus understood. He knew how he must appear to them, a large black man with calloused hands and clothes that had seen better days, sitting alone in a corner booth with the unmistakable aura of someone who had nowhere else to go. He had learned to make himself small in these spaces, to speak softly and move carefully, to project an image of harmlessness that might earn him an hour or two of peace. It was a survival strategy born of necessity, one that chipped away at his dignity piece by piece, but kept him safe in a world that seemed determined to see him as a threat rather than a human being. The bell above the door chimed, and Marcus looked up to see 2 police officers entering the diner. Officers Bradley and Reynolds moved with the swagger of men accustomed to authority, their utility belts creaking with each step. Bradley, a stocky man in his 30s with pale skin flushed red from the cold, scanned the room with predatory eyes. His partner, Reynolds, was younger and leaner, with the kind of nervous energy that suggested he was always looking for something to prove. Marcus felt his stomach tighten as their gaze settled on him. He had learned to recognize that look, the way their eyes narrowed slightly, how their hands unconsciously shifted toward their equipment. In his 20 years of military service, Marcus had commanded respect from soldiers of all backgrounds, had led men into combat and brought them home alive. He had medals in a storage unit somewhere that testified to his courage and leadership. But here, in this diner, all of that meant nothing. Here, he was just another homeless black man taking up space. Sarah appeared at their table almost immediately, coffee pot in hand and a professional smile masking her obvious discomfort. "Evening, officers, coffee?" Bradley nodded curtly, his eyes never leaving Marcus. "Yeah, and we might need to have a word with that gentleman over there." "And getting some complaints?" Marcus's hands tightened around his mug. Complaints about what? He had been nothing but respectful, had paid for his coffee and a small meal, had spoken to no one except Sarah when she took his order, but he knew that in situations like this, the truth was often less important than perception, and his very presence seemed to be perceived as a problem. Sarah's smile faltered slightly. "Mr. Washington, he's been a perfect gentleman. Never caused any trouble." "We'll be the judge of that," Reynolds interjected, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had never learned to question his own assumptions. "Just bring us our coffee and let us do our job." Marcus watched this exchange with the hyper-vigilance that had kept him alive in 2 war zones and countless dangerous streets. He recognized the trajectory of what was about to unfold. He had seen it happen to other veterans, other homeless people, other black men who had committed the crime of existing in spaces where they weren't wanted. The smart thing would be to leave now, to gather his belongings and disappear into the night before the situation escalated. But something in him rebelled against the idea of running again. This was America. He had sworn an oath to protect and defend this country, had bled for it in foreign lands, had lost friends to roadside bombs and sniper fire in service to its ideals. Surely he had earned the right to sit in a diner and drink a cup of coffee without being treated like a criminal. The thought filled him with a quiet anger that burned hotter than any campfire he had huddled around during his time on the streets. The officers approached his table with deliberate slowness, their boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Other customers began to take notice, conversations dropping to whispers as the drama unfolded. Marcus straightened in his seat, drawing on decades of military bearing to present himself with dignity despite the circumstances. "Sir, we need you to come with us," Bradley announced, his hand resting casually on his nightstick. "We've had reports of someone matching your description causing problems in the area." Marcus's voice was steady when he replied, though his heart was pounding. "What kind of problems, officer?" "I've been sitting here for about an hour, haven't spoken to anyone except the waitress." Reynolds stepped closer, invading Marcus's personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "Don't get smart with us. You know why we're here. Vagrant, loitering, probably panhandling earlier today." "I'm not a vagrant," Marcus replied quietly. "I'm a customer who paid for his meal. And I'm a United States Army veteran who served 3 tours of duty overseas," Bradley scoffed. "Yeah, right. And I'm a 4-star general? Come on, let's go. You can tell your stories down at the station." The dismissal hit Marcus harder than any physical blow could have. These men, who had likely never spent a day in service to their country, were treating his sacrifice as a lie, his service as a convenient fiction. The Medal of Honor recipient sitting across from them was invisible. Replaced by their preconceptions and prejudices, Sarah approached the table, her tray shaking slightly in her hands. "Officers, really, he hasn't done anything wrong. He's been coming here for weeks, always pays his bill, always polite." "Ma'am, step back," Bradley ordered. "This doesn't concern you?" But Sarah had seen enough injustice in her 60 years to recognize it when it was happening in front of her. "It concerns me when you're harassing a good customer in my section. Mr. Washington is welcome here." Reynolds' face flushed with anger. "Are you interfering with a police investigation?" The question hung in the air like a threat, and Marcus saw Sarah's resolve waver. He couldn't let this kind woman get in trouble because of him, couldn't let her risk her job or her safety for his sake. Throughout his life, Marcus had learned that sometimes the most courageous thing you could do was surrender when others were at risk. "It's okay, Sarah," he said gently. "I'll go with them. Thank you for everything." Marcus reached into his pocket for his wallet, intending to pay his bill and leave with whatever dignity he could maintain. The movement was slow and deliberate, his hands visible at all times, another survival technique learned through bitter experience. But Bradley's reaction was swift and violent, his hand immediately moving to his weapon. "Hands where I can see." "Them? Don't reach for anything." The entire diner went silent. Customers froze with forks halfway to their mouths, their faces reflecting a mixture of shock and morbid curiosity. Marcus slowly raised his hands, his wallet falling to the floor, with a soft thud that seemed to echo through the sudden quiet. "I was just trying to pay my bill," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system. Reynolds kicked the wallet away from Marcus's reach. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The handcuffs clicked into place with a sound that Marcus had heard too many times before, though never around his own wrists. The metal was cold against his skin, a physical manifestation of his powerlessness in this situation. As they prepared to lead him out of the diner, Marcus felt the weight of every stare, every whispered comment, every assumption being made about him based on nothing more than his appearance and circumstances. But then something remarkable happened. Sarah stepped forward again, her chin raised in defiance despite the obvious risk to herself. "Officers, before you take him, you should know something. Mr. Washington isn't just some homeless man causing trouble. Last month, he helped stop a robbery 3 blocks from here. Didn't ask for any reward, didn't want any recognition. Just help because it was the right thing to do." And every week he comes in here and leaves his leftover food for Jimmy, the kid who hangs around the alley. Never makes a big deal about it, just does it because that's who he is. Marcus felt a lump forming in his throat. He hadn't known that anyone had noticed these small acts of kindness, hadn't thought that his efforts to help others despite his own struggles had been seen or valued. In a world that seemed determined to render him invisible, Sarah had been watching, had been seeing him as a human being rather than a problem to be solved. Bradley's expression didn't change. That's all very touching, but it doesn't change anything. He's still coming with us. As they marched him toward the door, Marcus caught sight of his reflection in the window, a proud man reduced to this moment of ultimate humiliation, handcuffed and helpless while strangers watched and judged. But even in this darkest moment, something within him refused to break. He had survived Taliban insurgents and IEDs, had endured the invisible wounds of war and the grinding daily humiliation of homelessness. He would survive this too. The patrol car was cramped and smelled of disinfectant and fear. Marcus sat in the back seat, the metal cage separating him from the officers who continued to discuss him as if he weren't there. They talked about processing him quickly, about the paperwork they would need to fill out, about getting home to their families. To them, he was already forgotten. Just another case to be filed away and dismissed. At the station, the booking process unfolded with bureaucratic efficiency. Photos, fingerprints, personal effects inventoried and sealed in a plastic bag. Marcus answered their questions with military precision, providing only the required information and nothing more. He had learned to navigate hostile interrogations during his service, and these techniques served him well now. It was during this process that Officer Martinez, a veteran herself, took a closer look at Marcus's identification. Something about his bearing, the way he held himself despite the circumstances, had caught her attention. She was accustomed to processing the angry and the desperate, but Marcus was different. There was a dignity about him that seemed incongruous with his current situation. "Washington," she said, studying his ID. "You served?" 20 years, Army, Marcus replied simply. Martinez nodded slowly. She had seen enough returning veterans to recognize the signs, the way they held themselves, the discipline that couldn't be completely erased even by the worst circumstances. "What unit?" "1st Infantry Division." "Did 3 tours, Iraq and Afghanistan." "I was Air Force myself," Martinez said, her tone softening slightly. "Thank you for your service." The words were simple, but they carried weight. In a night filled with humiliation and dehumanization, this small acknowledgement of his sacrifice felt like a lifeline. Marcus nodded his acceptance. Maintaining his composure even as emotions threatened to overwhelm him, Martinez continued processing his paperwork, but something was bothering her. The charges seemed vague, the circumstances suspicious. She had worked with Bradley and Reynolds before and knew their tendency to bring in homeless individuals on questionable grounds. As a veteran herself, she felt a particular obligation to ensure that another veteran was treated fairly. "What exactly are the charges?" she asked the booking officer. "Loitering, disturbing the peace, possible vagrancy," came the reply. Martinez frowned. Possible vagrancy? Either he was engaging in vagrancy or he wasn't. "And what about the disturbing the peace charge?" "What did he actually do?" the booking officer shrugged. "That's what Bradley and Reynolds wrote up. Take it up with them if you have questions." But Martinez did have questions, and she intended to get answers. She had seen too many veterans failed by the system they had served, had watched good people slide through cracks that seemed designed to catch them. If Marcus Washington was being railroaded because of his circumstances rather than any actual criminal behavior, she was going to make sure the truth came out. Marcus was placed in a holding cell with several other men, most of whom appeared to be dealing with their own struggles with substance abuse or mental illness. The cell smelled of sweat and despair, a concrete box where society stored the people it didn't want to see or think about. Marcus found a corner and sat down, his back against the wall, and began to assess his situation. He had been in worse places, had endured conditions that would have broken many people. But this was different. This wasn't enemy action or the fortunes of war. This was his own country, his own community treating him as expendable. The thought filled him with a sadness that went deeper than anger, a profound disappointment in the ideals he had fought to defend. Hours passed. The sounds of the station filtered through the bar's phones ringing, conversations in the hallway, the occasional burst of laughter from officers going about their routine business. Marcus tried to sleep but found himself thinking about the path that had led him here. The series of small failures and large tragedies that had reduced a decorated combat veteran to this moment. He thought about Jennifer, his wife of 15 years, who had tried so hard to help him deal with the nightmares and the drinking that came after his final deployment. He thought about the job he had lost when the flashbacks became too frequent, the house they had lost when he couldn't work consistently, the slow dissolution of his marriage as his untreated PTSD poisoned everything he touched. Jennifer hadn't left him because she stopped loving him. She had left because she couldn't watch him destroy himself anymore. Marcus thought about his daughter, Alicia, now in college on the other side of the country. She sent him emails sometimes, careful messages that spoke of her life and studies while carefully avoiding the topic of his circumstances. He knew she loved him, knew she worried about him, but he also knew that his situation embarrassed her, made her feel helpless and frustrated. It was easier for both of them if they maintained their distance. Most painfully, Marcus thought about his father, Sergeant Major Robert Washington, who had died 2 years earlier without seeing his son get back on his feet. Robert Washington had been a career soldier, a man who believed in duty and honor and the power of hard work to overcome any obstacle. He had never understood how his son, who had been such a successful soldier, could fall so far so fast. The disappointment in his father's eyes during their final conversation haunted Marcus more than any memory from the battlefield. As dawn approached, Marcus was startled from his troubled thoughts by the sound of his name being called. A guard was unlocking the cell door, looking at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Washington, you're being released. Someone's here for you." Marcus gathered his few belongings and followed the guard down a corridor lined with administrative offices and interview rooms. His mind raced as he tried to imagine who might have come for him. Sarah from the diner, perhaps, though he couldn't imagine how she would have known where he was or had the influence to secure his release. The answer to his confusion was waiting in the lobby, a woman in her 50s wearing the dress uniform of a United States Army colonel. She was African American, with steel gray hair and eyes that seemed to miss nothing. When she saw Marcus approaching, she stood and extended her hand. "Sergeant Major Washington, I'm Colonel Janet Morrison, I believe. We need to talk." Marcus stared at her in confusion. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I think there's been some mistake. I don't know who you are or why you're here." Colonel Morrison smiled slightly. "No mistake, Sergeant Major, though I suspect you're wondering how I found you. The truth is, I've been looking for you for quite some time." She gestured toward a quiet corner of the lobby where they could speak privately. Marcus followed, his mind reeling with questions and possibilities. Nothing about this situation made sense to him, but years of military training had taught him to remain calm and gather information before making any judgments. "Sergeant Major," Colonel Morrison began once they were seated, "do you remember Operation Desert Shield, September 2006? Your unit was tasked with protecting a convoy of medical supplies to a remote forward operating base in Anbar Province." Marcus felt his breath catch. He remembered that mission vividly. It had been one of the most dangerous assignments of his second tour, a journey through territory controlled by insurgents who had proven particularly adept at ambush tactics. The convoy had been attacked twice, and only Marcus's quick thinking and leadership had prevented a catastrophe that would have cost dozens of American lives. "Yes, ma'am, I remember. During that mission, your convoy was attacked by a large group of insurgents. Your commanding officer was wounded in the first minutes of the engagement, and you took control of the situation. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, you managed to repel the attack and complete the mission. The medical supplies you delivered saved 17 wounded soldiers who would have died without immediate treatment." Marcus nodded slowly, wondering where this was leading. The mission had been classified at the time, and he had never spoken about it publicly. How did this woman know these details? Colonel Morrison continued. What you probably don't know is that one of those 17 soldiers was my son, Lieutenant David Morrison. He was a forward observer with the 101st Airborne, caught in an IED explosion 2 days before your convoy arrived. Without the blood plasma and surgical supplies you delivered, he would have died. Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. Throughout his years of homelessness, he had often wondered if his military service had meant anything, if the sacrifices he had made had been worth the cost. To learn that his actions had saved lives, had allowed a mother to keep her son, was almost too much to process. David came home, Colonel Morrison continued, her voice thick with emotion. He recovered completely, finished his tour, and went on to become a doctor. He's now a trauma surgeon in Atlanta, saving lives every day. Because you saved us first? Tears began to form in Marcus's eyes, but he fought them back. Ma'am, I was just doing my job. Any soldier would have done the same. No, Sergeant Major, they wouldn't have. What you did required exceptional leadership, courage, and tactical skill. Your commanding officer recommended you for the Silver Star, but the paperwork was lost in the bureaucratic shuffle that followed the unit's redeployment. You never received the recognition you deserved. Colonel Morrison reached into her briefcase and withdrew a leather folder. I've spent the last 2 years tracking down the witnesses from that mission, reconstructing the documentation and pushing through the military bureaucracy to correct this oversight. It's taken longer than it should have, but sometimes the system needs a little push from someone with eagles on their collar. She opened the folder and revealed a Silver Star medal, its blue and white ribbon pristine against the dark leather. Sergeant Major Marcus Washington, by order of the Secretary of the Army and in recognition of your gallantry in action against an armed enemy, you are hereby awarded the Silver Star for heroism in military operations against opposing forces. Marcus stared at the medal, unable to speak. Throughout his darkest moments on the streets, through the nights when despair seemed overwhelming, he had never imagined that his service might someday be acknowledged in this way. The medal represented more than recognition. It was validation that his sacrifice had mattered, that his life had value beyond what society currently assigned to it. There's more, Colonel Morrison said. I've been following your situation through various veterans organizations. I know about your struggles, your homelessness, your challenges with the system. What happened to you tonight? The harassment, the false arrest, it's unacceptable. No veteran should be treated that way, especially not one who served with such distinction. She pulled out her phone and showed Marcus a series of text messages. I've been in contact with the police chief, the mayor, and the district attorney. They're very interested in discussing the conduct of Officers Bradley and Reynolds. It seems this isn't the first time they've been accused of harassing homeless individuals. Marcus felt a surge of emotions he couldn't quite name. Relief, vindication, anger, hope, all swirling together in a complex mix that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. Ma'am, I don't understand. How did you know I was here? How did you find me? Colonel Morrison smiled. Sarah Henderson called. Me, she's my aunt. Marcus's confusion must have shown on his face because the colonel continued. Aunt Sarah has been talking about you for weeks. The polite homeless veteran who always treated her with respect, who helped others despite his own struggles. She was so upset about what happened tonight that she called me at 3 a.m. She gave me your full name, and once I ran it through military records, I realized you were the same Marcus Washington I'd been trying to find. The pieces began to fall into place for Marcus. Sarah's kindness, her willingness to stand up to the police officers, her obvious concern for his welfare, it all made sense now. She had seen him as a human being worthy of respect and protection, and when that respect was violated, she had acted. Now, Colonel Morrison continued, we need to talk about your future. I understand you've been struggling to find stable housing and employment. I may be able to help with both. She pulled out another set of documents. I run a nonprofit organization that helps veterans transition back to civilian life. We provide housing assistance, job training, counseling services, and advocacy. like to offer you a position with our organization. Someone with your experience and perspective could help us reach veterans who might otherwise fall through the cracks." Marcus stared at the job offer, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. After years of rejection letters and closed doors, of being invisible to a society that preferred not to acknowledge his existence, someone was offering him not just a job, but a chance to help others avoid the path he had been forced to walk. "Ma'am, I don't know what to say. This is more than I ever hoped for." "Say yes," Colonel Morrison replied with a smile. "Say yes, and let's get to work. There are a lot of veterans out there who need our help, and I have a feeling you're exactly the right person to reach them." As they walked out of the police station together, Marcus felt the morning sun on his face for the first time in years, without the weight of despair pressing down on his shoulders. The metal in his pocket seemed to pulse with warmth, a tangible reminder that his service had mattered, that his sacrifices had saved lives. Behind them, Officers Bradley and Reynolds were beginning what would be a very difficult day. The phone calls from their superiors had already started, and by afternoon, they would be facing suspension pending a full investigation into their conduct. The video footage from the diner's security cameras, combined with witness statements and Colonel Morrison's influence, would ultimately cost them their badges and their careers, but Marcus didn't know about their fate, and at that moment he didn't care. He was thinking instead about the future, about the veterans he would help, about the second chance he had been given. He was thinking about calling his daughter, about rebuilding the relationships he had let slip away, about becoming the man his father had raised him to be. Most of all, he was thinking about Sarah, the angel in a diner uniform who had seen his humanity when others saw only his circumstances. He would visit her that evening, not as a homeless man seeking shelter, but as someone with purpose and hope. He would thank her for her kindness, for her courage, for refusing to let him become invisible. As Colonel Morrison drove him to his new life, Marcus watched the city wake up around them. The same streets that had been his prison for 3 years now looked different, full of possibility rather than threat. The rain had stopped, and somewhere above the clouds, the sun was shining. Marcus Washington was going home.